This video is an introduction to some visualization work, manipulation of data and different ways of visualizing it. And the data I'm going to use here is in an Excel file. So data type, Excel actually is a text file. So it's a text file. Pay Gap Europe is the name of the file. I usually start with a preview so I can make sure the data is well behaved, that it starts on the second row and has titles on the first row, which this does. So I can just go ahead and import it. And what this data is, it's from Eurostat, and it shows European countries for a bunch of years. In fact, we should see what the data looks like by opening up this top part. There are 22 plus 5, 27 countries, years 2010 to 2021. Gross domestic product. This is the percent of the population that lives in urbanized areas. And you get a little snapshot of what these distributions look like. And all the rest of these numbers are percents, and they indicate the pay gap between men and women. So for instance, when you look at industry, Austria 2010, 24 here, there was a 24% gap in the average pay for men versus women, 24% higher for men than for women. The classification industry is actually a combination of some of these other sectors. I'm not sure exactly which ones, but I believe the footnotes in that table said it excluded things like public administration jobs. So we think of it as private industry, but it's not, I can't determine exactly which sectors were used and which were not. So that's one that you probably want to do more research on the exact definition. Otherwise, we have a number of sectors of the economy and the pay gap for each of them. And you'll notice there is some missing data here, which we'll talk about briefly later on. It's always important to keep in mind what's been missing. And in fact, at least from what we see here, Austria is missing a number of sectors and a number of years. If you just scroll down through here, there's some other missing data. So public administration is also missing for most, if not all, years from Portugal. So missing data can be very important. For my purposes now, I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to it. So what am I interested in the pay gap? I would like to understand what's been happening to the pay gap over time. Across different industries? Does it vary depending on what sector of the economy you're in? How does it vary across countries? And I'd like to highlight Austria in sort of some of these displays so that we can sort of see where Austria compares to other places over time and across industries. Okay, so first analysis, let's just get a rough idea about how these pay gaps, what they look like. Let's just do analyze distribution, and let's pick industry, which is a combination of a number of the sectors. Click OK. Let's get it horizontal, just clicking stack. And here's a picture of the distribution. This histogram, it puts it into bars. Usually the default setting will work pretty well, but if you click on this little hand tool, you can make the bars finer or grosser. I usually add a few bars to what's there just to get a better idea about what the shape looks like. The box plot is a fairly simple summary of this data. The middle 50% of the data is the box. The line in the box is the median. Half of the data is above that point and half is below that point. This is actually a mean. The average is that diamond shape in there, along with some kind of confidence interval for it, which has to do with statistical inference that we'll deal with later in the course, not right now. And the range of the data is shown. So we have pay gaps that range from actually, notice there's a negative number here. So there are some pay gaps negative, meaning that women earn more than men on average. And that might be interesting to look at. And as high as 30% pay gaps. On average, the pay gap was a little less than 14%. The median, 14.6%, means half of the years, countries, and sectors, half of that data was above 14.6% for a pay gap, and half was below. The mean and the median are fairly close. The fact that they're slightly different indicates that there is a little bit of skew to this distribution. It's not symmetric. You can sort of see that it kind of a little lopsided, leaning to the left here, and that's why the mean is actually a little bit lower than the median. You've reached the halfway point. You don't reach the halfway point until you get past where the mean value is. The mean is being pulled down by a lot of this data to lower values. If you're interested in those negative ones, the quickest way to get that is to take this lasso tool and highlight there. Actually seem to have picked up only one row down here from that. Let's just take a look at that. Go to table subset is the easiest way to pull it up. Luxembourg in 2021 was actually showing for industry a negative pay gap of 0.2%. So women earned more than men in industry in Luxembourg in that year. But notice for business, there was actually almost a 10% pay gap, 8% in manufacturing. Here where the negatives are, water supply, construction, a large pay gap in retail sales. So it varies quite a bit across the different industries for that one country, but for that country in 2021, this composite measure called industry was actually negative. Okay, well, this simple graph misses a lot because, in fact, we've combined different industries and different years. I guess the next step might be to just compare industry, which is sort of private sector, with something that might be the public sector. And I think we have public administration in here is the only clear public sector one. So what you might do is look at two distributions together, industry, public administration. And when you pick two of them at the same time, it's useful to put them on a uniform scale. So first, let me stack them so they're horizontal. Notice the scales are different. If you're going to compare them, it makes sense to help your eyes by clicking on the top right arrow and going to uniform scaling. And when you go to uniform scaling, often you lose a lot of the detail in the bars. So I'm going to go back in and add some more bars. And I can see there's a difference. It's just the top one seems to be located sort of to the right of the one below. It's sort of shifted over. So the higher numbers on the top than there are on the bottom. And that you can verify that by comparing the mean. On average is about a 14% pay gap in industry and 9.4% in the public sector. So might not be surprising that the public sector tends to have less difference in salaries between men and women. Whether that means there's less discrimination or whether it's due to the nature of the jobs or something else requires a lot more analysis. But we can clearly see that there is some difference. And you'll notice there's actually a number of negative values when it comes to the public sector. If we were to highlight the bars, I can highlight the bars. So I need to make this bigger. So those look like they're the negative values. And if we go to table subset, just to get a view for public administration, it looks like Latvia, a lot of the years, if not all the years, women were paid more than men. Hungary, we have a couple of early years. This is all, remember, this is all just public administration. Luxembourg, a couple of years, Malta, 1, and 4 years in Romania. Okay, well, one thing we want to do is, I know we're going to want to highlight Austria. So just to prepare for that, one thing we might do here is you might highlight Austria. It's now selected. There are 12 different years of data for Austria. And what we might do is under rows selection, we could have selected it manually, going to select where, but I selected on the top, it's already selected. Let me name that selection in a column. We'll call it Austria, and the selected ones, we'll say Austria. And if it's not been selected, we'll call it other. It says created a new column showing Austria and other. And this will help us as we go along. Let's go under this red arrow and go to color or mark by column. And click Austria. And you can control the colors here, but we'll highlight. Highlight red is an easy way to highlight data points. So we'll highlight the Austria in red. And then when we conduct analysis, in many analyses, the automatic coloring will show up and be easy to see where Austria is. So one thing we might do, because we have too complex a picture here, is we might want to select only certain rows. Like we might want to look at the latest year. So let's select where year is 2021. It's the last year of data. Let's just do that. Now, one option, if we want to just look at that 1 year, is we could go ahead and subset this. The problem with having it highlighted is if you do an analysis, the fact that it's highlighted won't affect the displays, except that it will highlight in the displays that year, but it will include all the other years. So one thing you can do is you can go to subset, and this pulls out just the 27 countries for the year 2021. And then you could do analysis here. So you could, for instance, look at the distribution of, let's pick a different one. Let's pick business. And here's how the 2021 pay gaps varied across different businesses. In this display, you don't see Austria highlighted, so we'll try a different display to see if the highlighting is automatic. But the average was about a 15% pay gap in business. If instead we use Graph Builder for that same thing, we take business, let's put it down here, and you can get a histogram there. And there's the same histogram produced through Graph Builder. And if you want to get Austria in this, I think you're going to have to try one of these boxes. And if you do it in the overlay, you'll see where Austria is sort of shaded on top of the others. So Austria, it looks like it was one of 2 countries that was in the highest sort of binning bar here in terms of the pay gap in business. If you want to do a lot of analysis, though, and if you want to look at other years, subsetting each time is going to become a bit unwieldy, create new data sets each time. Let me not save that one. So another option here, once we've highlighted this, is we could go to row selection and invert it to highlight all the other years. And then you have a couple of options here. You can hide and exclude, just hide, or just exclude. If you just hide it, it still will be computed in anything you calculate, like a mean value. If you exclude it, it may still show up in the picture, not hidden, but it won't be used in any of the analyses. Generally, what I would do is hide and exclude, then you won't see it and it won't be used in the calculations. Anything you do, if you hide and exclude it, would be to then the analysis would just be on the 2021 data, the same thing as if you had subsetted it into its own data table. I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to explore an individual year right now. So let me go and clear all the row states. Nothing is colored now either. So one more thing I'm going to do before I rearrange this data is I think it might be helpful, since we have so many sectors here, to focus on a few that we might think of as different kinds of work. So when I think about pay gaps, I think about, well, there's a lot of industries here that involve maybe a fair amount of physical labor. So mining, manufacturing, electricity supply, water supply, construction. These are all things I would think of as generally involving a fair amount of physical labor. So, and I could be wrong about that, as we'll discover. So if I highlight all those, we could create a formula using a new formula column. The quickest way to do this is if you right-click here and you go to new formula column. We can combine these by using an average. And that has created a new column that is the average of those 5 columns. And let me give that an easy name. I'll rename it as physical labor sectors. And then we might go through, we might pick several that we think are more what we'd call sort of mental kind of effort. Take information, financial, real estate, professional, scientific, administrative, public administration, education, and human health. Oh, I had the arts too. And let's do the same thing here. We'll go to a new formula column, combine, average, and let's call this mental work sectors. Now, if we go to Graph Builder, let's put year down here. And let's take these two that we just created, physical labor sectors and mental work sectors, control, highlight, so they're both at the same time, drag both over to Y. The default display has the data points and these sort of smooth lines. I think I might want to just sort of summarize this more easily by clicking to a line graph. You can see the trend over time, and this is sort of using the mean. You can control whether you want the mean. You could change it to the median on each of these by using the drop-down menu. One thing that seems clear here is there's a downward trend in the pay gaps in both of these areas. The somewhat surprising to me, the physical labor is having lower pay gaps than the mental work sectors. My initial guess might have been the opposite, but in fact, I can think of, at least three explanations. It could be that to the extent this is discrimination, there's somehow less of it in the industries that have a lot of physical labor. It could be because I suspect there are far fewer women employed in those sectors, that the ones that are employed get paid quite well. It could also be the kind of jobs they have in those sectors are the higher paying jobs. So even though if we look at mining, there's office jobs in mining, and maybe the women have the office jobs, and maybe those are the higher paying jobs. So a bunch of speculations that would require more work, but there is an obvious difference here. It's almost double the pay gap when you look at the physical work sectors. Now, a lot of analyses are going to be restricted here. Actually, I guess I could do that one more time though. Because we can add in some more information, take physical labor and mental labor again, drag it in here, go to this. We have a bunch of different countries, so what we might do here, a couple of ways to do this. One would be to do a local data filter, select country, and now you could click, look at Austria. Belgium, the difference seems to have disappeared in the last couple of years there. And you can go through one country after another. We could remove this filter. And instead, we could try looking at all of them at the same time by taking country and dropping it into the wrap box. And even though it looks like it may be too small, it's not really. If we go to a bigger one, and if we get rid of the control panel, well, actually, let me get rid of the legend, well, I guess we do need the legend. Let's get rid of the control panel. And this is what you should do when you're going to copy this into a document. Get rid of the control panel first. So all that extraneous stuff, those drop zones, won't appear in the graph. It's a much cleaner graph if you do it this way. I would also advise changing the titles. You just highlight it, type in a better title. Same thing for the axes. But here's a quick snapshot of all the countries. And so you can see fairly large difference in the pay gaps for the physical and mental work in Austria, Slovenia, Slovakia, Portugal, actually a lot of countries. The ones that don't have much difference is Estonia, Bulgaria, Denmark, Netherlands. So there's some where the pay gaps seem to be very similar. Whether or not this is meaningful to explore depends a lot on my initial judgment about what mental work was and physical work. And since there are such a variety of jobs in each of these industries, I don't know that it's really that meaningful to look at the sector overall without having more detail about what kind of jobs men and women may have in those sectors. Most of the analysis I want to do, though, is really going to be facilitated if we change the form of this data table. And one way to do that is to use tables stack. And let's say we take all of the sectors from industry to other. And we want to stack those into one column. We'll call that column the sector. And the the data is the pay gap, and the sector is what I'll call the label column. And we will keep all of the non-stacked columns. If you click OK, we get a new data table. It's been rearranged so that we have country, year, and now we have this sector column where all the sectors are in one column and the pay gaps next to it. And this is going to make it a lot easier to get some nice graphs out of this data. So now I'm going to do that same thing of picking Austria. And when it's highlighted, let's go to row selection, name selection in column, call it Austria. Other. And I'm going to color or mark by. Okay. So let's use Graph Builder and see what we can get. Let's put year down here. And let's see what the pay gap looks like over time. So here's our initial graph. The Austria points are in red, so you can see that Austria has in fact been highlighted, although with those rows highlighted, the other points are shaded out. When you just click in the white area, nothing's been highlighted. And so the red points are there, but they're very hard to see. They've sort of been, they kind of covered up by the blue points, but they're there. I can see, red points. So basic time trend, very hard to see that it's slightly downward, but what you see is there's a lot of variability here because the pay gap is across countries and industries in each year. So each year we have a bunch of different countries and a bunch of different industries. Each of those is a separate point. Looking at the points is too many. If we change to box plots, we get something a little bit easier to look at. The reason you don't see red points here is that I think Austria has fallen for all of these inside the, most of the data is between this point, this bottom whisker and the top whisker. You're thinking sideways, box and whisker plot. 50% of the data is in here, almost 25% here, and almost 25% here. And these are just some outliers. I'm not seeing any red points as outliers, so it doesn't look like Austria is one of the outlier points in any of these years. But there's quite a range here between the minimum and the maximum, even excluding the outliers. Gets simpler if we just go to bars. So if you want to know what's happened to pay gap over time, this one more clearly shows that on average, and again, this is the average. If you think the median would be a measure, you can go to the median, which is showing a little less of a change, but almost the same picture. I'll keep the mean there. The pay gap has been decreasing pretty consistently over time, from about 15% down to looks like about 13%. We hover there, I think we can mean 12%, 15% down to 12%. Progress in terms of getting rid of the pay gap, although it's maybe perhaps slow progress. I don't think we need to see the legend here, which is not adding anything. Well, we have a bunch of different industries in a bunch of different countries here. So one option is we could try wrapping, putting country into the wrap box. And so now I think you get some different patterns that emerge. Pay gaps across all industries now. So we're looking at the average each year, but across all industries. Austria seems to be showing relatively high pay gaps, as does Cyprus, but Cyprus is actually showing a pretty steep downward trend. You can see big pay gaps in Estonia, in the Netherlands, relatively small in Denmark and Finland, in Slovenia, in Romania. So we see some differences across countries. Of course, the problem is we don't have the sectors here. If we want to get, well, let me actually just click undo once. Instead, if we want to focus on the sectors, we can put that into the wrap box. And you can see very little pay gap when it comes to construction, which might be surprising. One thing we probably should check for that is if before you conclude its construction, I worry a little bit about the missing data. We could be missing, we might only have construction data from a few countries, in which case this is dominated by those countries, and they may not be representative of what the other countries look like that we don't have data on. So that could be, it's worth more exploration. But you see low pay gaps in construction, transportation, and water supply, quite high in the financial sector, business, high in the arts, in retail, trade, professional, scientific. So we see some difference in sectors. It would be nice if we can get the sectors and the countries at the same time. So one option here is to add a local data filter. And you could add country. And so then you can see the different sectors for Austria. We're missing a lot of data for Austria, especially for a period of a few years in the early part here. And you scroll through, you'll see that we get different patterns for different countries. Try working it the other way around. Let's just start over, putting year, pay gap. This time, let's put the country into the wrap box. Country into the wrap box. And let's add a data filter for the industry. Local data filter, the sector. Administrative, look at that, Bulgaria seems to be negative. So in Bulgaria, for the administrative sector, women every year were paid more than men on average. Do I believe that? I'm not entirely sure. So I'm a little suspicious. And then you look at Romania, and it's the same thing. So similar histories in a sense of those countries. What comprises the administrative sector there, I'm not entirely sure, but it just seemed like a very large difference in pay. Women paid more than men. And that seems to be inconsistent with pretty much everywhere else, although you see a little bit of that showing up in Croatia. So definitely something to look at there. If you go to business, you find positive pay gaps pretty much everywhere on average. So every country is showing men paid more than women, education, financial sector, very large pay gaps. So this display seems to be, I think, a little more informative than when we put country into the filter and sector into the wrap box. The nice thing about the graph builder is you get to play with these different displays very easily until you see a picture that actually seems to convey what it is that you want to focus on. Is the mining sector. Again, fairly low pay gaps overall compared to other sectors. Let's get rid of that filter. We can use those columns we created, those yeah, see if we can, let's put year back down here. And let's put country here. Pay gaps. Now you see the Austria showed up in red here, so it is colored. Color disappears when you go to the line gap, the line graph. So here's the trend over time, average across all sectors. So you can see the countries that had higher pay gaps. You can see by how steep they are or flat, whether it's been going down a lot or not. Pay gaps actually been increasing in a few countries. So that's somewhat of interest. Let's add this local data filter again. And let's just focus on there's the mental work sectors. There's our physical labor sectors. Start over. Let's put year down here. Let's put the pay gap here. Go back to our bars. Let's think about how income in the country and urbanization might relate to this. It's very hard to get multiple dimensions into one graph, but it is possible. So we could use the zone, this grouping zone. If you take a continuous variable like GDP and you drop it into the group, JMP will automatically put these in ranges, which you can override. You can do your own bidding, but the binning that is done automatically attempts to get about the same number of data points in each of these ranges. So if you look closely at the GDP gaps, there's about a $7,000 €7,000 range in this first bin. The second bin looks like it's about a €5,000 range. The next bin is about a €14,000 range. The way these bins were created is to try to get approximately the same amount of data in each of the bins. If you don't like these bins, you can do your binning manually, and you could create even bins of €5,000 or €10,000 or any way you want to. So do we see a pattern here? Well, the only pattern I see is everything looks similar over time and similar size pay gaps, except in the very lowest income. So the countries that are in the lowest income bin, lowest GDP, had smaller pay gaps actually. The pay gaps seem to be larger in wealthier countries, but the only difference, really big differences between the first bin and all the others. It actually looks like a little bit lower pay gaps as you get to the higher GDP countries, but only slightly. Let's just see if we can see where Austria shows up in this. So if you put it in there, you'll notice the red outlining here. So Austria in all these years was in that income range. So that doesn't really help us much. Let's drag GDP out of this and put urban population up here. How urbanized. And the binning here, you'll notice a very similar kind of picture, and I suspect that the urbanization and the GDP are actually pretty closely related here. One way to quickly check that, we might just do fit y by x, GDP versus urban population. Here's where you can see the color by row has highlighted the Austria points. Different years, but very close proximity to each other. So each of these is a different country, which is a collection of points very similar. So as time has gone on, the GDP probably has generally increased, and the percent of the population living in urban areas has probably increased too. That's why you see these sort of upward sloping sections. In the case of Austria, I don't see a lot of change, not a clear upward direction. Some countries, both have been increasing over this 12-year period pretty consistently. But within each country, it seems to be a pretty close relationship. More urbanized population and higher income seem to go hand in hand. Yeah, let's just try a couple more here. Instead of putting year there, let's try to put the pay gap data as Y. And let's try putting income as X. So now you can see with actually each income level put in, as well as each as the pay gap across all the industries is where Austria is, since the income is in a fairly narrow range. All the Austria points are in there, but there's a bunch of different industries in each year that are showing up. One way to highlight that would be to take the sector and put that into the wrap box. And actually, instead of bars, let's put the points back. So now you can see each sector, and you can see where Austria is, highlighted in red. You can see over different income ranges how the pay gap varies. Now, what would make this a lot easier to look at is to have some reference point, sort of, especially if you want to compare Austria to others. So what you might do is we might just find what the average pay gap is in the entire data set. It's 13.44. And what we can do is, if you hover over the y-axis and right-click, no, actually, double-click with the hand highlighted, we can put in a value of 13.44. Let's label that the average. Add that to a picture. And now you have the average pay gap across all sectors and across all years put into each picture. And so now you can quickly see whether Austria was above or below that average for all sectors in all years. It's just a very quick way of getting some kind of reference point, makes it a little easier to look at the picture. Yes, we can highlight the urban population. It's probably going to be a similar picture and put pay gap in. And now we can wrap country in it. This picture doesn't seem so useful because once you wrap country, you can see each country's urban population is in a fairly sort of narrow range. Austria is less urbanized population than many of these countries, like Belgium's at the extreme, where almost everybody lives in an urban area. Romania, almost nobody lives in an urban area. Shouldn't say it's nobody, it's about 50%, so about half the population, but it's low compared to all the other countries. And we could add a mean line in here for reference if we want. So the basic point here is you should be exploring different kinds of displays because the picture is sort of hidden, and there may be a picture that very clearly demonstrates something that's important to note, but finding that picture is not automatic. You really need to play with a variety of ways of looking at it. And good analysis is almost always multi-dimensional, and Graph Builder is one of the few ways that you can actually get multiple dimensions. Most graphs work well for 2 dimensions, X and Y. As soon as you try adding a 3rd dimension, it becomes complicated, and trying to get a 4th in there becomes extremely difficult. But Graph Builder is a way that you can reasonably get 4 things displayed at the same time. When you run out of ways to be able to look at the dimensions, I would be adding filters, and you can add more than one filter at a time. Filters work really well in an interactive environment where somebody can scroll through. But if you're doing a presentation, unless you can live interactively go through the filters, it's very hard in a document to use filters. If it's a live presentation, it's fine, but if it's a document you're preparing, filters don't work very well unless you can make it sort of online and interactive where somebody can scroll through the filters. So filters have a limited use, but it's very good for exploring the data if you can do it interactively. Okay, I will stop there as an introduction to Graph Builder.